I swear it started as a joke. One of those offhand comments you toss out half serious, half sarcastic, hoping to get a laugh or at least diffuse the heat in the air. If you were 35, I said, leaning back in the patio chair with a drink in my hand, the sun folding itself into the horizon behind her. I'd propose right now. The words floated out casually, like a balloon you didn't expect to pop. I grinned, looking down into my glass, expecting her to laugh or roll her eyes, maybe throw back one of her clever retorts. But instead, there was silence. The kind that lingers just a second too long and makes your skin feel too tight. And then she whispered it, almost like it was a confession. I'm 50. Does that change things? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Everything about that moment has been burned into my memory. The way her fingers absent-mindedly traced the rim of her wine glass, the tremble in her voice, and the flicker of something raw in her eyes. I'd known her for a couple of months, by then. We met at a local bookstore, one of those small, dusty, independent shops you think only exist in movies. I was flipping through a worn copy of East of Eden when she walked by and commented on my taste. I looked up and saw this woman, composed, elegant, striking in a way that wasn't loud, but impossible to ignore. Her voice had this low, calm tone that made you want to listen, and the conversation that followed was so easy I forgot where I was. 20 minutes later, we were still standing in the history section, surrounded by books neither of us would buy. She introduced herself as Eve. Like the beginning of everything, she said with a soft laugh. We started with coffee, then lunch, then wine on her back patio. I never once thought to ask her age. I assumed late 30s, maybe early 40s. She had this energy, sharp, sarcastic, effortlessly charming. But beneath that was something heavier, something grounded. She spoke like someone who had lived a few lives already, and somehow that only made me want to know more. I was 31, freshly out of a long-term relationship and floating somewhere between jaded and numb. She didn't ask questions I didn't want to answer. We talked about books, music, travel, nothing too personal, yet somehow everything felt personal. I wasn't looking for anything serious. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. But then, somewhere between the third bottle of wine and the fifth night of sitting under the stars with her, I started to realize I wasn't just enjoying her company, I was craving it. And then I made the joke. That stupid offhand comment that hit like a hammer. If you were 35, I'd propose right now. And her answer shattered the illusion I didn't know we were both holding on to. She was 50. Almost 2 decades between us. The weight of it sat between us like another person at the table. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but inside, my mind was scrambling. 50. That was older than I'd imagined. Older than I'd let myself consider. My mother was in her mid-50s, and yet here she was, beautiful, radiant, and suddenly fragile in a way I hadn't seen before. She stood up before I could respond, muttered something about grabbing a blanket, and disappeared into the house. I stared at the empty space where she'd been, the soft outline of her wine glass on the table, her book lying closed beside it. The air felt different now, thinner, heavier. When she returned, she had a blanket draped around her shoulders and a faint, unreadable smile. She sat down without looking at me, took a sip of wine, and asked the question again. So, does it? I didn't know what to say. I wanted to say no, that it didn't matter, that I was mature enough, open-minded enough. But the truth was more complicated. Of course, it changed things. It had to. The world doesn't let you ignore something like that. There are expectations, assumptions, timelines. And beyond all of that, there was the voice in my own head, filled with questions I didn't yet know how to answer. I hesitated, then said the only thing I could. I guess I just need a second to catch up. She nodded. No pressure, no anger, just a quiet understanding. That was what she gave me from the very beginning, space. And still, that night lingered. Something had shifted between us. Not broken, but tilted. A crack in the frame. We talked a little more, but there was a current beneath our words that hadn't been there before. I went home that night with a storm in my chest. I thought about what it meant, about what I was feeling, about what I was afraid of. I thought about how easily she laughed, how completely she listened, how she made me feel seen without ever demanding anything in return. And I thought about her eyes and the way they had looked at me after she spoke those 5 words. Does that change things? The truth is, age isn't just a number. It's a story, a life, a map of everything that came before. And hers was a story I didn't just want to hear. I wanted to understand. What came after that night surprised us both. What came after that night changed everything. The days after that conversation passed like a strange, slow fog. Nothing about our routines changed, and yet everything felt different. It was like walking through the same house with all the furniture rearranged. Familiar, but just off enough to make you hesitate. I didn't see her for 2 days after that night. Not because we avoided each other, but because life simply didn't place us in each other's orbit. I went to work. She had her things. But the silence between us wasn't empty. It was humming. Every minute I didn't see her felt like a question I was avoiding. And every time I thought about her words, they echoed louder. I'm 50. Does that change things? It played in my head like a loop I couldn't turn off. And every time I replayed it, I noticed something different. Her tone, her hesitation, the courage it took to say it out loud. By the 3rd day, I found myself standing at the bookstore again. Same aisle, same shelves, same impossible urge to feel close to her without calling or texting. I was holding a book I wasn't going to buy when I heard her voice. Not directed at me, just part of a conversation she was having with the store owner. The kind of casual, warm chatter that suggested she'd been coming here long before I showed up. I turned the corner slowly and saw her, hair pulled back, wearing a soft gray sweater and black jeans, smiling like nothing was different. And for a second, I wondered if maybe nothing was different. Maybe I'd made it all heavier than it had to be. Maybe she didn't even care. But then she looked up and saw me. And I saw it. The flicker, the pause, the weight she carried in her eyes even as her smile stayed in place. Hey, she said, walking over. Her tone was gentle, casual, but her hands fidgeted slightly, betraying her calm. Did you finish the book you bought last time? I nodded, unsure of how to act, my tongue clumsy in my mouth. I wanted to say something clever, something that would signal we were okay, that I was okay. But all I managed was, not yet. Got distracted. She tilted her head and smiled faintly. Life does that. We ended up grabbing coffee from the shop next door, settling into the same corner table we'd taken over a dozen times before. But this time, the table felt smaller. Or maybe we were just more aware of how close we were sitting. Our conversation danced around the obvious. We talked about books, the weather, the city's ridiculous parking enforcement, but everything was tinted now, like someone had adjusted the color saturation on our connection. We both knew it. We just weren't ready to name it. Eventually, I said it. Not the whole thing. Just a sliver. You caught me off guard the other night. She didn't flinch. She just nodded and said, I know. Then, after a pause, I almost didn't say it. I leaned back, watching the way she stirred her coffee even though she didn't take sugar. Why did you? She looked up then, really looked at me, and her voice was steady. Because I liked the joke too much. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding and laughed softly. It wasn't a bad joke, I said. Just a poorly timed truth. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. We sat in silence for a while after that. Not uncomfortable, but thick. It was the kind of silence that held a question in it, hovering just between our coffee cups. I don't know who broke it first, but eventually we started, talking about things that mattered more. Her first apartment in the city, the art show she curated years ago that no one came to, the way she once dyed her hair blue on a dare and regretted it instantly. I told her about my failed startup, about how I once drove halfway across the country for a girl who ended up marrying someone else, about how I sometimes felt like I was running out of time without even knowing what I was chasing. And as we spoke, the age thing didn't disappear. It just became less of a headline. It didn't go away, but it stopped screaming. It sat there like a quiet truth in the corner of the room, acknowledged but not all-powerful. She didn't apologize for her age, and I didn't pretend it didn't matter. It did. It still does. But what mattered more in that moment was the way she made me feel when she listened, how she didn't try to fix or judge or one-up, just listened, fully, presently, like I was worth being known. After coffee, we walked. No destination, just movement. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, and for a while we didn't talk. We just walked side by side, and every now and then our hands would graze, and my heart would skip like a scratched vinyl record. At one point, I reached out and took her hand. I didn't think about it. I just did it, and she didn't pull away. We walked like that for blocks, hand in hand. No labels, no declarations. Just two people deciding that for this one moment, the rules could wait. When we got back to her place, we stood by her front gate, and she looked at me like she was waiting for me to say something. I didn't. I just leaned in and kissed her. Soft, hesitant at first. Then with the kind of clarity that only comes when you stop thinking and just feel, she kissed me back. Not urgently, not desperately, but fully. Like someone who knew what it meant to be kissed by someone who was still figuring himself out. That night, I didn't stay over. We didn't talk about what the kiss meant or what would come next. We just said goodnight, and I walked home feeling like someone had lit a fuse inside my chest. I didn't know what we were. I didn't know what we were becoming, but I knew it wasn't nothing, and that was enough. For now. The morning after the kiss, everything felt louder. The birds, the city sounds. Even the silence in my apartment seemed to hum with a strange kind of static. I woke up early, restless, like my body hadn't caught up with what had happened the night before. It wasn't just the kiss. It was the decision it implied. A step forward, even if neither of us had labeled it. I didn't reach for my phone right away. I didn't text her. Part of me wanted to, just to say good morning, to bridge the distance between her front gate and my front door. But another part, quieter, more cautious, told me to wait. Let the moment breathe. Don't rush it. I made coffee and stared out my kitchen window like something outside was going to offer clarity. The sky was gray, overcast. One of those days where time feels like it stretches and folds in on itself. I thought about her. About the way she kissed me. About the way she looked at me afterward. Calm, unreadable. Like she'd already made peace with whatever came next, whether I called or didn't. By noon, I was pacing. Every logical part of me said to just carry on. Go about your day. Do the things. Don't turn this into something it isn't. But logic was never the strong suit of someone who kisses women outside iron gates under falling leaves. Eventually, I gave in and sent a simple message. Hey, thinking about last night. Hope your day's off to a good start. It wasn't poetic, but it was real. A few minutes later, she replied, Me too. Coffee later? I don't remember typing. Yes, but I must have. Because by 4 o'clock, I was standing outside her front door again. She opened it with a soft smile, hair tied back, barefoot, wearing a faded blue sweater that made her look impossibly serene. She let me in without a word, and we moved through the kitchen like we'd been doing it for years. She poured the coffee. I found the mugs. The small talk was easy. Weather, a neighbor's unruly dog, a book she was halfway through, but the undercurrent was there. We both felt it. Eventually we settled into the couch, and the conversation slowed. That's when she turned toward me and said, So, what are we doing? Not accusatory, not anxious, just open, clear. I didn't have a rehearsed answer. I hadn't mapped out a plan. All I knew was that I wasn't ready to walk away, and I didn't want to pretend this was casual anymore. So I said the only thing that felt honest. I don't know exactly, but I want to keep seeing you, and I'm not interested in anyone else. She nodded slowly, eyes steady on mine. Okay, she said, as if she'd already decided she could work with that. And maybe she had. Maybe she knew something I didn't. We didn't define anything beyond that. No titles, No expectations. Just a mutual agreement that whatever this was, it wasn't over. After that, our rhythm found a new beat. I started spending more evenings at her place, sometimes talking for hours, sometimes just reading on opposite ends of the couch, our feet barely touching, and somehow that was enough. Other nights, we cooked. She loved trying complicated recipes she'd clipped from magazines, and I became her sous chef, mostly chopping onions and making a mess. We didn't talk about age, not directly. It was there, of course, woven into the fabric of our interactions, but it stopped being the center of the room. I noticed the way she paused when talking about her past, choosing which stories to tell. I could tell she edited herself, not out of shame, but maybe to spare me, or maybe herself. And I started noticing things, little things. She didn't use social media much. She had a folder full of old photo prints instead of scrolling through her phone. Her references leaned more toward Fleetwood Mac than The Weeknd. She once mentioned a concert she went to in the 90s, and I realized I'd been in elementary school at the time, but it didn't feel weird. If anything, it made me listen more closely. Her stories had depth, layers I hadn't encountered before. There was a gravity to her, a quiet wisdom that made me feel simultaneously young and lucky. But the world doesn't always mirror what you feel inside. The first time we were out together and someone gave us that look, I felt it. It was subtle. Just a glance from a woman behind the counter at a wine bar, that quick flick of her eyes between us, the slight pause in her smile. I brushed it off, but I saw Eve register it too. She didn't flinch. She never flinched. But I knew she noticed. Later that night, I asked her, "Do people ever say anything?" She looked at me for a moment before answering. "Not often, but sometimes I see it. The look. The mental math." She smiled faintly. "They're trying to figure out if I'm your mom or your lover." I laughed awkwardly, but there was an ache in her voice that sat with me long after. I started thinking more about what it meant, the invisible things we were carrying. For me, it was the fear of what people would think, what my family would say. For her, it was the weight of having already lived through stages I hadn't yet reached. She'd been married, divorced, she'd owned a business, lost people, built a life. I was still figuring mine out. And yet, we kept showing up for each other. Not in grand gestures, but in small, steady ways. She never asked where this was going. She never pressured. But every now and then, she'd let something slip, like when she asked what I saw my life looking like in 10 years, or when she said, "You'll probably want kids someday," in a tone that sounded more like a statement than a question. Didn't know how to answer that. Not yet. I wasn't even sure if I did want kids. But I knew she was thinking ahead, preparing herself for the moment I might realize our timelines didn't line up. And maybe that was fair. Maybe she was trying to protect both of us. But here's what I knew. When I was with her, I didn't feel the gap. I felt grounded, like I was closer to the person I wanted to be. And maybe that's what scared me the most. How easy it was to imagine building something real with her, even when logic said we were mismatched. One night, she fell asleep on the couch while we were watching an old movie. Her head rested on my shoulder, and I listened to the rhythm of her breathing, soft and even. I looked down at her and felt a wave of something I couldn't name. Not just affection, commitment, maybe. A pull toward her that felt both terrifying and safe. And in that moment, I stopped worrying about how long this would last. I stopped trying to predict the end. I just let myself be there, with her, in the quiet, in the in-between. Because sometimes, what starts as a joke turns into something worth holding on to, even if you don't know how the story ends. The first time I brought Eve around my friends, it wasn't planned. It wasn't a grand, deliberate choice. I wasn't trying to make a statement or test anyone's reactions. It was a Saturday afternoon, warm and breezy, and she just helped me pick out some shelves for my apartment. We were already downtown, hungry, and I remembered my buddy Lucas had invited me to this casual backyard thing he was throwing. Nothing formal, just beers, burgers, a few people from work. I told her about it as we were parking, kind of half thinking she'd pass, but She surprised me. "Sure," she said, "if you want me there." I did. At least I thought I did. And maybe I hadn't fully considered what it would feel like walking into that kind of space together. But I said yes, and we drove the short distance with the windows down and the music up, like we were just two people spending a lazy day together. Lucas lived in this old craftsman house with a giant oak tree in the yard, and enough outdoor string lights to make it look like a Pinterest ad. There were maybe 20 people scattered around when we walked in, holding red cups, leaning on fences, laughing over grill smoke. I spotted a few familiar faces from work and nodded toward them. Then I looked at Eve, who had stepped slightly behind me without meaning to, her hand brushing mine. We hadn't discussed what we were, who we were to each other, and in that moment I realized how much the world sometimes forces you to decide. I introduced her simply, "This is Eve," and left it at that. People smiled, shook her hand, offered her drinks. No one said anything strange or rude, but the math was there, behind their eyes. I could see it. The subtle calculation, trying to place her. Friend, date, boss, aunt. She handled it with grace, like she always did. She complimented the playlist, asked Lucas about the seasoning on the burgers, and laughed easily at the right moments. She didn't cling to me or act like she needed affirmation. But I saw the way she occasionally glanced in my direction, her smile flickering a little faster than usual. It made me want to reach for her hand in a way I hadn't in public before. But I didn't. I didn't because I wasn't sure what that would mean in front of these people who only knew one version of me. The younger, simpler version. The guy who dated women who looked like they belonged in the same yearbook. Later, while she was talking to a couple of my friends near the fire pit, I overheard someone behind me say quietly, "Is that his mom?" They laughed, quickly, nervously, like they knew it was a bad joke, like they didn't mean harm. But it hit harder than I expected. I didn't turn around or say anything. I just felt the flush crawl up my neck and the sudden urge to leave. Not because I was embarrassed by her, never that, but because I hated how quickly people reduced something complex and human into a punchline. I made my way over to Eve, smiling as naturally as I could, and offered her another drink. She looked up at me, caught something in my eyes, and asked, "You okay?" Nodded. "Just hot," I said. She gave me a look like she didn't quite believe me, but she let it go. When we left that night, the drive was quiet. Not tense, just quiet in a way that felt like both of us were sorting through something we didn't want to say yet. She didn't bring up the comment. I wasn't sure if she'd heard it, but I did. As we pulled into her driveway, I finally said, "Someone asked if you were my mom." I expected a wince, maybe a sigh, but she laughed, not bitterly, just knowingly. "It's not the first time," she said. "It won't be the last." She sat for a moment, engine off, keys still in hand. "Does it bother you?" I shook my head too quickly, and then slowed myself down. "It pisses me off more than anything, because they don't see what I see." She looked at me then, full on, and her face softened. "And what do you see?" I didn't answer right. Away. I reached over, took her hand and said, "Someone who makes me feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." She invited me in, but we didn't talk much more that night. We curled up on the couch, and I let her rest her head on my chest while the television played something neither of us were watching. I kept running the moment through my mind. The fire pit, the comment, the flash of shame. And I hated that. It had found its way into something so personal. But it also made me realize that if I was going to walk this path with her, I had to do it with my eyes open. This wasn't going to be simple, and it wasn't going to be private forever. There would always be whispers, assumptions, quiet judgments. The question was whether what we had was strong enough to stand against all of that. In the days that followed, things continued as usual. But I found myself noticing the micro moments more. The way she hesitated before introducing me to a neighbor. The way her tone shifted ever so slightly when I mentioned a new coworker who was my age. The way she would sometimes watch me when she thought I wasn't looking, like she was searching for signs of my eventual departure. And I started thinking about it too. About time. About the things I hadn't done yet. About the milestones. she'd already passed. Not in a fearful way, but in the way someone does when they realize that love, real love, demands more than feeling. It demands courage. Not the kind of courage that screams, but the kind that stays. The kind that holds, hands in the middle of a storm and says, "I'm still here." One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, I asked her what scared her most about us. She didn't answer right away. She dried a plate, set it down, then turned to face me. "Losing you slowly," she said. "Not because something goes wrong, but because life pulls you forward and I can't keep up." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell her that would never happen, that we'd move at the same pace, that I wasn't going anywhere. But I knew she wasn't looking for promises. She was just letting me see the map she carried in her heart, the map that showed all the places she'd already been, and all the reasons she'd learned to prepare for goodbye. I stepped closer, wrapped my arms around her, and held her there, in the soft kitchen light. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Sometimes the only answer to fear is presence, and I was still here. It wasn't anything she said outright. That was the thing. Eve never pressed, never demanded answers, to questions I wasn't ready to ask myself, let alone answer aloud. But over time, I started feeling it. This subtle shift, a kind of emotional draft sneaking through the seams of our comfort. It would come in moments that seemed innocuous at first, like when I mentioned that my sister was expecting her second child, and Eve just smiled and asked, "Are you close with your niece?" Or when she asked, with almost comedic nonchalance, if I'd ever considered living abroad, and I said, "Maybe one day," without realizing until later how that one day might never be our day. That's the strange part about age gaps. They don't hit you in big, dramatic scenes. They hit you in timing. They hit you in the silent in-betweens where your timelines brush against each other but don't quite align. One afternoon we were walking through a local farmer's market. She loved those. Said there was something honest about imperfect fruit and people who sold things they made with their hands. We stopped at a stand with hand-woven baby blankets, bright and soft and impossibly small. I don't know what made me pause there. Maybe curiosity, maybe something deeper. But I picked one up and rubbed the corner between my fingers. Eve came up beside me quietly, glanced at the display and said, "You'd be a good dad." Just like that. Like she was talking about the weather. My stomach tightened, and I don't even know why. I smiled, shrugged, set the blanket down. "Maybe someday," I said. She nodded but didn't say anything else, and we kept walking. But for the rest of the day, I couldn't shake it. Not her words, but the quiet behind them, like she had already accepted something that I was just starting to circle. That night, we sat on her patio, sipping wine, the air still warm with the echo of summer, and I finally asked, "Do you want kids?" I expected her to deflect, to say it was irrelevant at her age or that she hadn't thought about it in years, but she didn't. She took a long sip, looked out at the trees beyond her backyard and said, "I used to. I really did. There was a window where I thought it would happen, but it didn't, and eventually I made peace with that. Doesn't mean the want ever fully leaves you. Just means you learn how to live around it." I nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of her words. She wasn't trying to influence me. She was just being honest. But that honesty stuck to my skin in a way that didn't wash off, because I didn't know what I wanted yet. I'd never had to. It always felt far away, theoretical. And suddenly, it wasn't. The following week, my mother called and invited me to a family dinner. It had been a while since I'd gone home, holidays mostly, or the occasional birthday. I wasn't close with my parents in the warm, emotional way some people are. But we were fine, safe, predictable. She asked if I was seeing anyone, and for a moment, I froze. I could have lied, could have said no, or played it off. But something in me said it was time. "Yeah," I said. "Her name's Eve." My mom asked what she did, where she lived, the usual checklist. I answered casually, keeping it light. And then she asked, "How old is she?" I paused. "She's older." "How much older?" she asked, her tone now wrapped in something more pointed. 19 years, I said. Silence, then. Oh. Just that. Oh. Like the sound of a door closing quietly in a distant room. She didn't criticize, not directly. She didn't say I was making a mistake or that she disapproved. But I knew that tone. I'd grown up with it. That was her polite way of folding judgment into silence. Dinner that weekend was polite, stiff, like I had brought an uninvited guest that only I could see. I didn't bring Eve, and I didn't mention her again. But I felt her absence like a weight in the room. My father asked about work. My sister chatted about daycare and how her toddler wouldn't stop putting crayons in the toaster. I smiled, nodded, played along. But I kept thinking about how Eve would have laughed at that story. How she would have asked if the crayon actually melted or just jammed the mechanism. I realized in that moment that she was the person I wanted in those spaces with me. Not just in the late-night talks and bookstore corners, but in the messy, complicated rooms of family and future. And I also realized how hard it would be to fit her into those rooms when they'd already been furnished with so many assumptions. Later that night, back at her place, I told her about the dinner. About how I hadn't brought her up again. About the way my mom said, oh, like it carried all her fears and judgments in one tiny syllable. Eve didn't flinch. She just listened, the way she always did. Quiet, open, without agenda. I understand, she said. It's not easy. I looked at her then, really looked at her. This woman who had walked through her own storms long before I ever met her. This woman who had learned how to carry rejection with grace and fear with humor. And all I could think was how unfair it was. That people would judge her for being too much life, while others were celebrated for having none at all. I leaned in and kissed her, slow and deep. And when we pulled apart, I said, I don't care what they think. But she just smiled, sad and wise, and said, maybe not now, but someday you might. And that stayed with me, long after the lights went off and the house went quiet. Because love, real love, doesn't live in the grand gestures. It lives in the slow accumulation of moments where you choose the person in front of you, over and over, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's hard, even when the people you care about don't understand. And so the question became, would I keep choosing her? Would I keep showing up? Not just in secret, not just in safe spaces, but out loud, in the world, in the future, in the face of all the what-ifs and maybes. I didn't know the answer yet, but I was starting to understand that the only way to find it was to stay. The space between us didn't arrive like a storm. It wasn't dramatic. There were no fights, no harsh words thrown across rooms, no slammed doors or ultimatums. It came quietly, like a slow cooling of the air. Like when summer starts giving way to fall and the heat lingers, but you know it's leaving. We still saw each other, still exchanged texts and called and met for coffee. But something had shifted. The energy was different. We were careful with each other now, a little too careful, like people handling a fragile heirloom they weren't sure how to fix if it broke. It started with small things. I'd go a day or two without texting, not because I didn't want to, but because I told myself I was busy. She didn't press, just responded with the same warmth when I eventually reached out. She never accused, never demanded, never made me feel guilty. And maybe that was part of the problem, how easy it was to slip into silence with her. How gracefully she let me drift without reaching to pull me back. At work, I found myself throwing more energy into everything, volunteering for new projects, staying late even when it wasn't required, filling my calendar with noise. I told myself it was ambition, that I was stepping into the next phase of my life. But deep down, I knew I was stalling. Creating distance, not just from her, but from the questions she made me ask without even meaning to. Questions about future, commitment, sacrifice. Questions that, before her, had always lived in the later category of my brain, the someday column. Now they were right here, staring at me from across dinner tables and silent car rides, and I didn't know how to hold them. One night, after an exhausting 14-hour day, I went back to my place and collapsed on the couch. I saw that she had texted me earlier. Hope your day wasn't too brutal. Made lemon pasta tonight. Leftovers, if you want them. I stared at the message, thumb hovering over the keyboard. I typed sounds amazing and then erased it. I typed I'll come by in a bit and erased that too. Eventually, I just put the phone down and stared at the ceiling. I didn't go. I didn't reply. I told myself I needed sleep. Told myself tomorrow would be better. But as I lay there in the dark, I knew it wasn't just about the pasta. The thing is, I missed her even when I wasn't with her. That was the cruel part. It's not like the absence made me feel free or unburdened. If anything, it made me feel more hollow. But instead of reaching for her, I kept turning inward, as if I had to figure everything out on my own before I could let her back in fully. I wasn't scared of her. I was scared of what I might have to give up to keep her, and that realization made me feel small, petty, young. Like I was still standing at the threshold of something I didn't quite have the courage to walk through. The next weekend, I finally called and asked if she wanted to go for a drive. She said yes, of course, and didn't ask why I'd been distant. We met by the coast and drove without a destination, windows down, the wind making conversation almost impossible. Maybe that's why I chose it. Talking without talking. We stopped. At a lookout point, climbed out and leaned against the hood. The ocean stretched out in front of us, dark and endless. Waves catching the last bits of sunlight like silver thread. She didn't ask anything, just waited, letting the silence open like a door. I don't know how to do this, I finally said. She turned to me slowly. Do what? I hesitated, looking at her, then at the sea. Be with someone who's already lived so much, who already knows what she wants, who doesn't need convincing. She didn't look hurt, just thoughtful. And what is it you're afraid of? I laughed softly, bitterly. Of screwing it up, of wasting your time, of finding out I want different things too late. She was quiet for a moment, then said, You don't have to protect me from disappointment. I've lived through it before. I can survive it again. Her words weren't meant to sting, but they did, because they reminded me that while I was still imagining possible futures, she had already survived the collapse of her own. I wish I'd met you 10 years ago, I said, almost without thinking. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. 10 years ago, I wouldn't have been ready for you. I was a mess back then, still trying to prove things to people who didn't matter. I looked at her, really looked, and saw the weariness behind her calm, not weakness, but fatigue. The kind that comes from years of showing up anyway. The kind of tired that doesn't beg for rest, only honesty. When we left the lookout, we didn't talk much. She held my hand on the drive back, fingers laced loosely, like she knew better than to grip too tight. When I dropped her off, I walked her to the door. She turned to me and said, You don't have to have all the answers right now. Just decide if you still want to ask the questions with me. I nodded, kissed her cheek, and drove away, feeling like I was holding something fragile and heavy in my chest, a truth I wasn't ready to name, but couldn't ignore anymore. Back at home, I sat on the edge of my bed and thought about what it meant to choose someone. Not just to love them. Love is easy. It comes quickly, sometimes without warning, but choosing? That's the part they don't write songs about. That's the daily act of returning, of saying yes again, and again, even when you're tired, even when you're unsure, even when the world looks at you sideways and whispers all the reasons why it won't work. I hadn't said those words to her yet. Not in the way that mattered. I love you. I'd felt it, sure, in fleeting moments. In the curve of her smile, the way she laughed at her own stories, the quiet steadiness of her presence. But I hadn't said it. Maybe because I didn't want to speak something I wasn't sure I could live up to. Maybe because I knew, once I did, everything would change. But I also knew this. Silence, too, is a choice. And eventually, every silence becomes something you have to answer for. I don't know what finally pushed me to say it. Maybe it was the way she looked at me that night, like she was preparing to let go. Not angrily, not sadly even. Just quietly. The way people do when they've waited long enough for something unspoken to be spoken, and it hasn't come. We were sitting in her kitchen, a movie playing in the background, untouched glasses of wine on the table. She'd made dinner, something with rosemary and lemon, the smell still clinging to the air. I was pretending to scroll through my phone, lost in my thoughts, while she absently folded a dish towel in her lap, again and again, like her hands needed something to do. When I looked up, she was watching me, not with accusation, but with that same calm patience she always had. And that's when I said it, quietly, almost like an apology. I love you. Her hands stopped moving. Her eyes didn't widen or well up or look away. She just held my gaze, steady and soft, and after a beat she said, I know. And that was it. No fireworks, no swelling background music. Just the truth, finally in the air between us, and her willingness to catch it without asking why it took so long. The days after that were different, not because we suddenly became some perfect version of ourselves, but because there was finally a center to everything, a place to return to when doubt crept in. She didn't start expecting more from me, and I didn't promise more than I knew I could give. But the difference now was that we both acknowledged what had been there all along. And somehow, that made the silences feel safer. I started noticing how I touched her more, reaching for her hand in grocery store lines, brushing her hair back behind her ear while she read, placing my palm gently on the small of her back when we crossed the street. Little things. Things I hadn't realized I was withholding before, like I'd been rationing affection until I figured everything out. But now that I'd said the words, it was like the lock had turned, and everything that had been waiting behind it could finally come through. But love doesn't solve everything. It doesn't erase the questions, the logistics, the very real world we both still lived in. It just made them heavier, because now there was more to lose. She didn't say it back right away, not because she didn't feel it, but because Eve was never careless with language. She didn't believe in saying things just to say them. Her silences were intentional, honest. So I waited. Not with resentment, but with respect. And maybe a little fear. Because now I was the one exposed. Now, it was me on the edge, hoping she'd meet me there. It was during one of our quieter weekends, no plans, no distractions, that she finally said it. We were sitting on the floor of her living room, an old jazz record playing, drinking cheap red wine straight from the bottle like teenagers. She had her legs curled beneath her, wearing one of my old sweatshirts, hair tied messily at the back of her head. She looked up at me, suddenly serious, and said, "You know I love you, right?" Just like that. No preamble. No ceremony. Like she'd been waiting for the right kind of stillness. I nodded, felt a smile crack across my face before I could stop it, and whispered, "Yeah, I do." And that was the first moment I truly let myself believe in us. Not just as a feeling, but as something with shape and direction. Something real. For a while, it was good. Really good. Better than I'd let myself imagine. We found a rhythm. Her place one week, mine the next. Shared toothbrushes, swapped playlists, learned each other's habits and soft spots. She never made me feel small for the things I hadn't yet figured out. And I tried not to shrink from the parts of her life that were already fully formed. She had routines, vitamins arranged by day, laundry done every Sunday, a precise method for watering her plants. I, in contrast, lived in organized chaos. But she never tried to fix me. Just made room for my mess, as long as I respected the edges of her calm. But then something shifted. Not between us exactly, but around us. Like the outside world had finally caught up to the little world we'd built. My friend Ethan invited me to a wedding. An old college buddy out of town, black tie. One of those events that felt more like a reunion than a celebration. When I asked if I could bring someone, he said, "Of course. You still seeing that woman?" The pause before the word stung more than it should have. I laughed it off, said yeah, still seeing her, and changed the subject. But that pause stayed with me. That pause was loaded, and for the first time in a while, I found myself wondering what it would look like. Her on my arm in a sea of people barely older than me, women who still talked about bachelorette parties and starter homes, Guys who still bragged about fantasy leagues like they were stock portfolios. Would they look at her and see what I saw? Or would they see a woman who didn't fit the scenery? Would they wonder why she was there at all? I brought it up to her that night, half joking, but I wasn't really joking. Would you even want to come? I asked, trying to sound casual. She tilted her head, thoughtful. To a wedding full. Of your college friends? She said, smiling. Sure, why not? I hesitated. I mean, they might… I don't know. It might be weird. She didn't get defensive, just looked at me for a long moment, then said, weird for who? And there it was, the question I'd been avoiding. Because the truth was, it wouldn't be weird for her. It would be weird for me. Because I was still wrestling with the idea of loving her in public. Loving her where people could see and measure and compare. And I hated that I wasn't already past that. She didn't press. She just said, let me know what you decide, and kissed me on the forehead like she knew I wasn't ready to answer. And the thing is, I hated myself a little in that moment. Because love should be loud. It should be proud. And I was still trying to love her safely. Still trying to protect the illusion of simplicity, when the truth was far more complicated. And far more beautiful. That night, lying in bed next to her, I stared at the ceiling and thought about the wedding, about the world, about how we spend so much time trying to fit into places we've outgrown. And I wondered, was I building a future with her, or just visiting hers? I didn't end up inviting her to the wedding. I told myself it wasn't the right time, that the trip would be rushed, that she'd be uncomfortable flying out for a weekend just to play arm candy for people she'd never meet again. But the truth was simpler and uglier. I was afraid. Afraid of the stares, the polite nods laced with confusion, the quiet whisper I'd hear in someone's voice when they leaned over and asked, how do you know her again? I justified it by pretending to protect her, to spare her from a situation she never asked to be in. But really, I was protecting myself, from embarrassment, from judgment, from the reality that loving her out loud meant tearing down a version of myself I'd been clinging to for too long. When I told her I was going alone, she nodded, smiled, and said, okay, have fun. She didn't ask why. She didn't argue. She just let it go. And somehow, that hurt more than anything else could have. The weekend passed in a blur of awkward reunions, forgettable speeches, and overpriced cocktails. I laughed in the right places, told old stories like I meant them, and pretended that something wasn't clawing at the back of my throat every time I glanced at my phone and saw nothing. I didn't text her, and she didn't text me. It was the first time in months we'd gone 3 days without talking, and I told myself that was normal, that couples needed space. But the silence between us didn't feel like space. It felt like absence, like something had been unplugged. I went back to my hotel room each night and lay in the dark, staring at the glow of the ceiling, imagining what it would have felt like to have her next to me, to have her lean in during the toasts and whisper something sarcastic in my ear, to have her wear that black dress she kept tucked in the back of her closet for occasions. Instead, I was there alone, surrounded by familiar faces that suddenly felt like strangers. When I got back, I expected her to ask questions, to tease me about the event or demand stories. But she didn't. She opened the door like I was a neighbor, dropping by, offered me coffee, and carried herself like nothing had happened. That, more than anything, told me everything had. We sat on her couch, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, and talked about nothing. I told her about the mediocre chicken, the out-of-control flower girl, the friend who drank too much and fell into a bush. She laughed politely, nodded, and offered comments in the right places, but there was a softness missing from her eyes. A withdrawal I couldn't name out loud but could feel in my bones. It wasn't anger. It was acceptance. That terrifying kind of peace someone wears when they've started pulling away, not because they stopped caring, but because they know you won't meet them where they are. A few days passed like that. Pleasant conversations, light touches, polite distance. She didn't press. I didn't explain. But every hour that went by, I felt her sliding further away from me, like sand slipping between my fingers, and no matter how tightly I tried to hold on, I couldn't stop it. One night, after a long, quiet dinner, I found myself staring at her while she washed dishes. Her sleeves were rolled up, and her hands moved rhythmically beneath the running water. She was humming something under her breath, some old song I didn't recognize. And the image hit me like a punch. It was domestic, beautiful, intimate in the most mundane way. And for a moment, I imagined it differently. Me beside her, not just visiting, but living there. Sharing this life, not just dipping into it when it was convenient. The thought both warmed me and scared the hell out of me. She noticed me staring and smiled gently. "What?" I opened my mouth, and for a moment, I thought I'd say it. Something real, something brave. But instead, I said, nothing. Just thinking. She dried her hands, walked over, kissed the top of my head, and said, "Don't think too hard. It's just Tuesday." And just like that, the moment passed. But it didn't leave me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed for hours, my mind looping the same questions. What was I doing? What was I so afraid of? Did I love her enough to stop hiding? Or did I love the idea of her? The safety, the wisdom, the quiet confidence, but not the actual cost of being with her fully, publicly, and unapologetically? It's easy to love someone in private, in candlelight, in the safety of closed doors, but real love is inconvenient. It's loud. It asks you to stand up in front of the room and say, yes, this, her, us, even if you don't get it, even if it makes you uncomfortable. And I hadn't done that. Not once. Not really. The next morning, I showed up at her place without texting first. She opened the door in a robe, hair still damp from a shower, and blinked at me like she wasn't sure I was real. "Hey," I said, breathless from nerves. "Can we talk?" She stepped aside without a word, and I walked in. I stood in the middle of her living room, hands in my pockets, heart hammering, and said, "I should have brought you to the wedding." She didn't react, just stood there, arms crossed, waiting. I continued. "I didn't not bring you because I didn't want you there. I didn't bring you because I was scared of being looked at, judged. Like maybe they'd see you and wonder what you were doing with me, and I couldn't take that." Her expression softened, but she stayed quiet. "I've been hiding behind indecision," I said, "and pretending like it's patience. But really, I've just been avoiding choosing you out loud. And I'm sorry. You deserve someone who doesn't flinch when people look, who doesn't make you feel like a secret." Her eyes glistened, just for a second. She stepped toward me, took my face in her hands, and said, "You're not the only one who's scared, you know. I've been waiting for you to run. I've been bracing for it, trying not to get too comfortable because people like you don't usually stay." I shook my head, overwhelmed, and whispered, "I don't want to run. I want to figure out how to stay." She kissed me then. Deep, slow. The kind of kiss that feels like a vow. And maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't a promise that everything would be perfect, or that we had it all figured out. But it was a beginning. A new kind. One that didn't hide. One that looked the world in the face and said, "Yes, we're here." Things didn't change overnight, but they changed. That conversation, that kiss, that moment in her living room, those weren't fixes. They were declarations. They were a beginning, but beginnings always come with echoes. The first few days after felt lighter. Not easier, but lighter. Like some invisible pressure had been released. She smiled more. I lingered longer. We moved around each other like people who had been holding their breath, and were just now remembering how to exhale. I started leaving. Things at her place on purpose. A toothbrush, a book, an old hoodie I pretended to forget but hoped she'd wear. She didn't say anything about it, but the next time I came over, the hoodie was hanging on the back of her kitchen chair. It felt like a quiet agreement, a mutual nod that said, "You live here too, even if only in pieces." I told a friend about her. Not just mentioned her, but really told him. We were at a bar, just the two of us, and I said, "I'm seeing someone. Her name's Eve. She's older than me. A lot older, actually." He blinked, like he wasn't sure how to process it. "How much older?" he asked. I told him. He laughed, uncomfortably, not unkindly. "Damn," he said. "So what's it like?" I didn't know how to answer that. Like what? Loving someone, with more life behind her than ahead? Loving someone who didn't play games, who didn't waste time, who didn't let fear drive her decisions? "It's good," I said finally. "It's honest." He nodded, sipped his drink, and didn't press. But I could tell the information sat strangely with him, like a math problem that didn't quite solve itself. That's what I was learning. Most people want their stories to make sense. They want symmetry, predictability, the right ages, the right steps, the right sequence of things. But love doesn't always follow blueprints. Sometimes it builds itself in strange places, unexpected corners. Sometimes it looks like a woman of 50 wearing your hoodie while she waters her plants, and you suddenly realize that this moment, this ordinary moment, is the thing you never knew you were missing. Still, with all that blooming softness, I could feel the questions gathering just outside the door. Not hers, mine. Quiet ones that crept in late at night when the wine wore off and the world got too still. What did this look like a year from now? 5 years? Would I want children? Could she give them to me? And if she couldn't, if she didn't, would I eventually resent her? These weren't questions I wanted to ask. They felt selfish, cruel even. But they came, uninvited, and they stayed. I started carrying them like invisible luggage, packing and repacking them every time I looked at her and saw the future inching closer. Then came the day she took me to an art show. A friend of hers was exhibiting at a gallery downtown, and she wanted me there. Not as her secret, not as her guest, but as her partner. I dressed up, wore the blazer she liked, tried to carry myself with confidence. But the second we walked into that space, I felt it. That prickle of attention, the subtle glances, the way people looked at me, then at her, then back at me. Most didn't say anything. But some did. A man near the wine table, maybe in his late 50s, leaned in and said, "Your son has great taste." He meant it as a joke, but it landed like a slap. Before I could speak, Eve smiled and said, "He's not my son. He's my heart." Then she turned away, wine in hand, graceful as ever. But I saw the flicker in her eyes, the weariness, the fatigue of always having to explain. On the drive home, we didn't talk much. She stared out the window, her hand resting on the console, between us. I reached over and took it, and she held mine. But her grip was softer than usual. "Does it ever bother you?" I asked quietly. "What people think?" She shrugged, then said, "Less than it used to. But some days it wears me down, especially when I see it bothers you." I tightened my grip on her hand. "I'm working on that." She smiled. "Barely. I know. But working on it isn't the same as living with it." That line stuck with me. It haunted me. Because she was right. I was still treating us like a transition, like something I could ease into gently, instead of a reality I had to step into fully. We got back to her place and sat in the car for a few minutes before going inside. "Tell me something true," she said suddenly, looking straight ahead. "Something real." I took a breath. "Sometimes I worry that I won't be enough for you. That I'm still too unfinished." She turned toward me slowly. "And I worry you'll outgrow me," she said. "That one day you'll wake up and want someone whose clock is still full of time." We sat there with our fears laid out between us like cards on a table, and maybe that was the most honest we'd ever been. Not in the love, but in the fear. Because if you love someone and don't fear losing them, maybe it's not love. Maybe it's comfort, familiarity. But this was sharp-edged and sacred, and terrifying, because it meant something. Inside, she lit a candle like she always did after gallery nights, poured 2 glasses of wine, and turned on the same playlist we always listened to when we needed to feel grounded. We didn't talk much, just sat close, breathing, letting the presence do the work. I didn't have answers that night. I still don't. But I knew one thing for sure. I didn't want to keep loving her with one foot out the door. I didn't want to keep waiting for the world to understand before I decided to stand beside her without flinching. Because love like this, messy, imperfect, real, it doesn't come around twice. And if you're lucky enough to find it, the question isn't, will the world accept it? The question is, will you fight for it, even when it doesn't look the way you thought it would? It happened on a Thursday. Just an ordinary Thursday. I was stuck in a long staff meeting at work, the kind where no one really wants to be there, but everyone pretends it matters. My phone buzzed once, then again, then 3 times in quick succession. I glanced down, expecting a group chat or a reminder. I'd forgotten to turn off, but it was Eve. First a text, call me when you can. Then, actually, if you're free now, please call. And finally, as I reached to unlock my phone, a missed call. My stomach dropped in that sudden way it does when you know, without knowing, that something's wrong. I excused myself from the meeting, muttered something about an emergency, and stepped into the hallway. The second I called her, I could hear it. Her voice was calm. Too calm. That kind of strained composure people wear when they're trying to keep their fear from bleeding through their words. I'm at the clinic, she said. They found something in my blood work. It's probably nothing, but they're running more tests. The words hit me like a slap, not for what they said, but for what they could mean. I asked if she was okay, if she needed me, if I should come right now, and she said no. Not yet. She said it was probably routine, that they'd just seen a few irregularities, that she didn't want me to leave work for something that might turn out to be nothing. But her voice betrayed her. It was too even, too rehearsed, like she'd had time to practice the line and hoped I'd believe it. I told her I was on my way anyway. She didn't argue. The drive felt longer than it was. My mind spun in every direction. Worst-case scenarios, things I hadn't said yet, things I might not get the chance to. I arrived at the clinic, heart thudding, and found her sitting in the waiting room with a magazine in her lap she clearly wasn't reading. Her eyes met mine, and for a second, she looked surprised. Then she smiled, that soft, familiar smile that somehow both welcomed and warned me. You didn't have to come, she said quietly. Yeah, I replied, but I wanted to. She closed the magazine and stood. I could see it now, the tightness in her shoulders, the tension in her mouth. She was scared, and she was trying not to be. We sat together in the bland room, chairs too close to be comfortable, waiting for the nurse to call her name. She told me it was probably her thyroid, something minor, manageable. But her words were clipped, her hands fidgeting. I've been feeling tired lately, she admitted, more than usual, and dizzy sometimes. They just want to rule things out. I nodded, unsure what to say. Everything I wanted to offer felt hollow. But I stayed. I stayed because sometimes presence is the only language that matters. Eventually, they called her in. I waited in the lobby, feet tapping, heart heavy, wondering how love could feel so big and so powerless at the same time. 30 minutes passed. Then 45. When she finally came back out, her face was unreadable. She sat down next to me and said, "They want to do more imaging, next week. It could be something with my liver, or nothing. They don't know yet." I didn't ask what she was thinking. I didn't ask if she was scared. I just reached for her hand and held it, and she let me. That night, everything was quieter. We ate dinner at her place, something simple, and watched a movie we didn't finish. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was protective. Like we were both trying not to disturb the balance, not to speak the possibility aloud. But I knew she was thinking it. I knew because I was too. What if this was something real? Something big? What would it mean for us? For a future we hadn't even figured out yet. When I finally asked her, hours later, while she sat curled at the edge of the bed, looking at nothing in particular, she didn't dodge. "I don't want you to feel trapped," she said. "If this turns into something, if it's more than just a health scare, you don't have to stay out of obligation." The words hit like ice. "Is that what you think I'd do?" I asked, barely above a whisper. She turned to me, her face soft, tired. "I think you're still young," she said. "I think you still have choices. And I don't want to be the reason those choices get smaller." It was then I realized just how heavy she'd been carrying me this whole time. How many quiet concessions she'd made. How many invisible fears she'd pushed down to make space for me to figure myself out. She hadn't just been waiting for me to choose her. She'd been waiting for the moment I'd decide it was too much. Too complicated. Too real. And now, she was giving me a door, an exit. Clean, quiet, noble. But I didn't want the door. I wanted the fire, the noise, the everything. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. "Even if this is something. Especially if it is." She didn't cry, but her eyes closed like she was holding back a wave. "Okay," she said. "Okay." And that was all. The following days were slower. The world outside kept moving. Work meetings, phone calls, errands. But our little orbit spun more gently now. We didn't talk about the test results coming next week. We talked about dinner, about books, about a recipe she wanted to try if she felt up for it. But beneath it all, we were bracing. Not just for the results, but for the emotional truth they would force us to confront. If life had taught her anything, it was that nothing is guaranteed. And if loving her had taught me anything, it was that time, when it's right, can mean more in months than most people get in decades. That weekend, I stayed over without leaving once. We woke up late, drank coffee slowly, spent hours just being near each other, like presence alone could stitch something invisible back together. I watched her more closely now. Her hands, her breath, the way her laughter sometimes ended with a sigh she tried to hide. I didn't push. I didn't ask for declarations. I just stayed. Because staying, I realized, is its own kind of promise. One you don't speak. One you just prove. The test results came back on a Monday. A gray, heavy-skied Monday that felt like it had been waiting all weekend to deliver bad news. I was at work, knee-deep in emails I wasn't really reading, when Eve texted me. They called. "Can you come over? No emojis, no punctuation, just that." I didn't ask what the results were. I didn't text back a dozen questions like I wanted to. I just replied, "I'm on my way." The drive was silent. No music, no phone calls. Just the sound of my own breath and the dull thud of my heart hitting harder than usual against my ribs. By the time I pulled up to her house, I felt like I'd already been holding my breath for an hour. She opened the door slowly, not like she was expecting me, but like she wasn't quite sure she wanted to say anything out loud. Her face was unreadable, calm, composed, like always, but I could see it in her eyes. Something had shifted. She stepped back to let me in, and I followed her into the kitchen where 2 mugs of untouched tea sat cooling on the counter. She didn't speak right away. Just picked up one of the mugs, held it in both hands, and stared into it like it might give her the courage to start. I didn't rush her. I just stood there, watching, waiting, knowing whatever came next would redraw the lines between us. "It's not cancer," she said finally, her voice steady. "But it's serious. Early-stage liver disease, autoimmune. They caught it early, but it's not going away. It's something I'll have to manage for the rest of my life." I exhaled without realizing I'd been holding it. Relief and fear collided in my chest. Not cancer, not terminal, but still, not nothing. I walked over, wrapped my arms around her from behind, and rested my chin on her shoulder. She leaned into me, just slightly, and whispered, "It's going to change things." I didn't answer, not because I didn't agree, but because I didn't know what those changes would look like yet. All I knew was that she was still here, and I still loved her, and that, for now, would have to be enough. We sat on the couch after that, the mugs, forgotten, the afternoon light casting long shadows on the floor. She explained the treatment, medication, dietary changes, frequent monitoring. "Manageable," she said again, like repeating the word would make it lighter. "But it'll affect my energy. There will be bad days, maybe long stretches of them. I won't be who I used to be, not entirely." I reached over and took her hand. "You think I was in love with who you used to be?" I said. She looked at me, searching my face, and then laughed. A soft, fragile sound that cracked open something in both of us. That night, I made dinner. It wasn't good. I burned the chicken and forgot to salt the vegetables, but she sat at the table and smiled anyway, watching me like I was performing some sacred ritual. Afterward, she curled up next to me on the couch and fell asleep before the movie even started. I didn't wake her. I just sat there, her head against my chest. One hand resting on her back, the other running gently through her hair. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about the future. I wasn't running numbers in my head or imagining worst-case scenarios. I was just there, in that moment, with her breath rising and falling against me. And it felt like the only place I ever wanted to be. Over the next few weeks, we adjusted. She started treatment. Some days were good, normal even. Others were harder. Mornings where she couldn't get out of bed without nausea. Nights where she was too exhausted to eat, let alone talk. But she never complained. Not once. And I never left. I drove her to appointments, sat in waiting rooms, flipping through outdated magazines, brought her herbal teas and warm socks, kissed her forehead when she was too tired to lift her head. It wasn't heroic. It was just what love looked like when life got real. But outside our little world, things kept moving. Friends started asking more questions. My mom called more often, her tone shifting from casual curiosity to gentle concern. "How's Eve doing?" she'd ask, like she was testing the ground before stepping forward. I knew what she meant. She wanted to ask how I was doing, if I was sure, if I understood what I was getting into, if I realized this might not get easier, that this wasn't the kind of relationship where you coast on autopilot. But I also knew this. None of the easy relationships I'd had before had ever made me feel the way Eve did, even on her worst days. And that had to mean something. One night, as we lay in bed, she turned to me and said, "You don't have to stay, you know. Not just because I'm sick." I sat up, heart thudding. "Is that what you think this is?" I asked. "That I'm here out of pity?" She shook her head. "No. I think you're here because you're kind, because you're good. But I don't want your goodness. I want your want. I want to be chosen, not accommodated." I leaned down, kissed her slowly, and whispered, "Then let me choose you again and again, until you finally believe me." We didn't talk about it much after that. Not because it wasn't important, but because the words had already been spoken. Now it was about showing up. Every day. In the small ways. The real ways. I started learning how to be more present, not just with her, but with myself. I stopped hiding behind hypotheticals, stopped trying to solve a future that didn't exist yet. I just stayed. And in the staying, I discovered something deeper than certainty. I found commitment. Not the performative kind. The lived-in kind. The kind that shows up in grocery runs and medication alarms and quiet hands holding tighter when the pain sets in. Loving Eve was never going to be easy, but it was always going to be worth it. Fall arrived slowly, slipping into our lives without ceremony. The air got cooler, the leaves turned, the evenings stretched earlier and the mornings darker. I started bringing Eve tea before she got out of bed, not because she asked me to, but because I began to learn her rhythms. The days when her joints ached more. The mornings when her face said she needed warmth before words. We moved around, each other like people who had lived together for years, and in some ways, we had. Not measured by calendars, but by moments. By the kind of intimacy you don't find in time, but in trust. She let me see her at her worst. Sick, exhausted, scared, and I showed up. And somehow that act, repeated enough, became love in its most tangible form. But as the season deepened, I could feel something shifting. Not in her health, though the fatigue stayed and some days were heavier than others. But in the air, between us. It was subtle, a delay in her laugh, a longer pause before answering certain questions, like she was drifting, or maybe anchoring herself somewhere I couldn't quite see. One evening, while folding laundry, she asked, "Do you ever think about what you'll be doing when you're 50? I looked up, startled not by the question, but by the look on her face. Serious, soft, a little distant. I haven't thought that far ahead, I admitted. She nodded and kept folding. You should. Time has a way of sneaking up on people who avoid it. That stuck with me. Not because she was right, which she was, but because I realized I still carried a part of me that treated this relationship like it had an expiration date. Like I was living in the now, but the then belonged to someone else, someone closer to my age. Someone who could promise her decades instead of years. But what she never asked, and what I never admitted, was whether I'd ever actually wanted decades with anyone before her. I hadn't. The idea of forever never made sense to me until it was wrapped in the smell of her cooking, the sound of her humming in the shower, the way her hand fit in mine like it had been waiting there all along. Still, I noticed her looking at me differently, not with doubt, but with something that felt like preparation. Like she was getting ready to protect me from a future I hadn't yet seen coming. I started catching her staring at my face in quiet moments. After dinner, before bed, during commercials, and when I'd ask what she was thinking, she'd just shake her head and say, "Nothing, just memorizing you." The first time she said it, I laughed. The second time, I didn't. One Saturday morning, we went to the market like we always did. She wore her favorite oversized scarf, the one that made her look like she'd stepped out of some Parisian film, and I carried the grocery bags while she inspected produce like it was art. A woman passed us, young, maybe late 20s, and looked at us just a second too long. Not with judgment, with curiosity, with wonder. I felt it, and so did Eve. Later in the car, she said, "You should date someone who can grow old with you." I didn't answer right away. My hands tightened on the wheel. "Why do you say stuff like that?" I finally asked. She turned to me, smiled faintly. "Because it's true, and because I love you enough to say the thing that scares me." I pulled over, parked in a lot that faced nothing but a wall of red and orange trees. "Do you think I'm confused? That I'm just here until someone more age-appropriate comes along?" She took my hand, rubbed her thumb across my knuckles. "No," she said. "I think you're here because you love me. I also think life is long and people change, and I don't ever want to become the reason you feel stuck." That word, stuck, rang in my ears like a threat. It wasn't how I felt, but now that she'd said it, I started wondering if one day I would. Would I wake up resenting what I gave up for this? Would she? I reached for her face, turned it gently toward me and said, "I'm not stuck. I'm choosing this. Every day." She smiled again, kissed my hand, and whispered, "I know. I just don't want you to forget what else is out there." I didn't have an answer for that, because she wasn't wrong. The world was still out there, full of people my age, full of opportunity and options and years I hadn't lived yet. But none of that world felt as real as the way she looked at me when she was tired but trying. The way she remembered my favorite foods better than I did. The way she had become my home without ever asking to be. That night, I lay awake beside her, the sound of her breathing soft and slow, and for the first time in a long time, I thought about the future not as a thing to fear, but as something I might actually build, with her, or maybe even for her, if the time came when she couldn't anymore. Because love wasn't just about the now. It was about showing up even when it got inconvenient, even when it stopped being easy, even when the seasons changed, and the questions got heavier, and the world didn't clap for your decision. It was the box in the closet that started it. Not because I was snooping, but because she'd asked me to grab a spare set of sheets while she was cooking downstairs. Her linen closet was always too organized. Eve didn't do clutter. Everything had a place, folded neatly, labeled in handwritten tags that smelled faintly of lavender. But when I reached for the shelf, I noticed a worn cardboard box tucked into the corner, taped along the edges like it had been opened and resealed too many times. It wasn't labeled. It wasn't dusty. It felt kept. Like something too important to throw out but too heavy to unpack. I wouldn't have opened it. I swear I wouldn't have. But when I handed her the sheets and mentioned it casually, "You've got an old box up there," I saw her expression flicker. Not fear, not anger, just something close to pause. A kind of long, private breath she hadn't meant for me to notice. She didn't say anything at first, just took the sheets from me, placed them on the bed, and said, "That's—" She stopped, started again. "That's Daniel's." The name hit me with the quiet weight of something sacred. I'd heard it before, briefly. A memory she carried, more than a man. Her ex-husband, the one who died, car accident, 10 years ago. She rarely spoke of him, not out of avoidance, but out of reverence. Like she didn't want to reduce a full life to anecdote. I didn't press. I didn't ask what was in the box. But later that night, when we were sitting at the kitchen table, the candle burned low between us, she brought it up again. "Do you want to see it?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, neutral. Not inviting, but not guarded either. I hesitated. Wasn't sure if it was a test or a trust fall. "Only if you want to share it," I said. She nodded once and disappeared upstairs. When she returned, she was holding it gently, both hands underneath like it was something living. We sat on the floor, together, the box between us, and she opened it slowly. Inside were pieces of a life I hadn't lived, photographs of them when they were young and bright-eyed, travel stubs, handwritten notes folded so many times they were starting to fall apart, a watch, a wedding ring, and then, tucked underneath, a worn leather journal. "He used to write things down," she said. "Thoughts, poems, pieces of nothing. He never called it a journal, said that was too precious." She smiled at the memory, the kind of smile that doesn't threaten what exists between us now, but honors what existed before. I didn't read the journal. I didn't even ask. But she let me hold it. Let me feel the weight of it, and that gesture alone broke something open in me. Because it meant she trusted me with her whole story, not just the part that started when I walked into the bookstore that day. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. I wasn't the first great love of her life, and I might not be the last. But I had the privilege of being this one, the one she chose, even after all that grief. The one she was building something new with, even with all the old still echoing in her bones. We didn't speak for a while after she put the lid back on the box. We just sat there, side by side on the floor, and I let her lean against me. I could feel the way her breathing slowed, softened, like something inside her had finally been exhaled. And as I held her there, I realized I didn't feel threatened. I didn't feel lesser. I felt invited into a life that was layered and complicated and real, into a woman who had lost and loved and still somehow had room for more. That night, as we lay in bed, she traced slow circles on my chest with her fingertip and whispered, "I never thought I'd do this again. Not like this." I turned to face her. "Love?" I asked. She nodded. "Not after losing him. Not after everything else. I thought I was done. That kind of love. It breaks something in you. But then you came along and you didn't fix it. You just didn't ask me to hide it anymore." I didn't know what to say, so I just kissed her forehead, pulled her closer, and let the weight of her story settle between us like an extra pillow we both knew how to sleep beside now. The next morning, she left the box on the dresser. Not hidden, not displayed, just there. And that was her way of saying it didn't have to be a secret. That I was strong enough to hold her past and her present. That she trusted me not to compete with ghosts, but to simply stay human beside them. And maybe that's what love really is. Not the absence of other loves, but the inclusion of them. The willingness to say, "This is who I was. This is who I've been. And if you still want to walk beside me, I'll make space for who we can become." The first time I invited Eve to a gathering with my friends, I told myself it was just dinner. Casual, simple, no pressure. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. It was a shift. A declaration I hadn't made out loud yet. Up to that point, our world had existed in corners, Coffee shops, bookstores, quiet dinners, her home or mine. It was real, yes. Intimate. But not fully out in the open. And something about that had started to itch at me, like wearing a coat that fit too tight, across the shoulders. I wanted to stop compartmentalizing my life. I wanted to merge. So when my friend Maya invited a group of us over, nothing fancy, just food and conversation, I said yes. And then I asked Eve to come with me. She didn't hesitate, but I could tell she was measuring something behind her smile. "Are you sure?" she asked, voice soft, eyes searching mine. "Because once we do this, it's not just us anymore." I nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle into my chest. "I know, and I want that. I want them to know you." She didn't say anything for a second, then reached over, brushed my cheek with her thumb and said, "Okay then, let them know me." The night of the dinner, she wore a simple black dress with a silver chain around her neck. Minimal makeup, hair pulled back, elegant without effort. I watched her getting ready in the mirror, catching glimpses of her reflection as she applied lipstick, and I realized how rare it was to see her nervous. She wasn't afraid of judgment. She'd lived through enough to stop caring about the shallow stuff. But this wasn't about being judged. It was about being misunderstood. About walking into a room where the glances would come fast and the unspoken math even faster. I knew it. She knew it. But she came anyway. We arrived a little after 7. Maya greeted us with her usual warmth. A glass of wine in one hand and a dish towel in the other. Her eyes flicked to Eve just a second longer than necessary, and I caught the flicker of surprise before it was replaced with a practiced smile. "You must be Eve," she said, extending a hand. "He's mentioned you." Eve shook her hand, replied graciously, and for a moment the air held its breath. Then someone else walked over. Another introduction, another brief pause, and just like that, we were in it. The room wasn't hostile. No one said anything cruel, but the energy was undeniable. Curiosity tinged with confusion. People were polite, welcoming even, but I could feel their questions vibrating beneath the surface. Who is she? How old is she? Is this serious? I watched Eve navigate it like a pro. She asked people questions, laughed at the right moments, made them feel seen. She never overcompensated, never tried to prove anything. She just was, unapologetically herself. And slowly, I could see the room adjust to her presence. The tension melted bit by bit as they stopped trying to categorize her and started simply experiencing her. At one point, I stepped into the kitchen to grab more wine, and Maya followed me. She leaned against the counter and said, "She's lovely." I nodded, pouring into the glass. "She is." Maya hesitated, then added, "You sure you're ready for all of this?" Her tone wasn't judgmental, just cautious, like someone asking a friend if they're wearing the right gear before hiking into a storm. I turned to her and said, "I've never been more sure of anything." She smiled, half admiration, half concern. "Okay," she said. "Then I hope the rest of the world learns to catch up to you." Back in the living room, Eve was deep, in conversation with 2 of my friends, laughing about a story I'd forgotten I'd even told her. Watching her there, fully herself in a room full of strangers, I felt something shift inside me. Pride, yes. But something deeper, too. A sense of alignment. Like for the first time, the person I loved wasn't just real in the quiet parts of my life. She was real in the loud parts, too. In the messy, noisy, opinionated places where people form opinions and draw lines, and she held her ground. Later, as we walked back to the car, the night air crisp and clean, she slid her hand into mine. "You okay?" I asked. She nodded. "You?" I smiled. "I think we survived." She laughed, the sound warm and unguarded. "They like you," I added. "You charmed them." She didn't look at me, just said, "That's not the hard part." I knew what she meant. Charm isn't love. Approval isn't acceptance. And the real challenge wasn't the first room. It was every room after. Every family gathering. Every milestone. Every moment where the difference between us might be hard to ignore. We got in the car, and as I started the engine, she rested, her head back and closed her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. I reached for her hand. "For what?" "For not hiding me anymore," she said. The words weren't accusatory, just honest, and they gutted me. Because she was right. I had been hiding her, not out of shame, but out of fear. And tonight, something had shifted, not just in how others saw her, but in how I let myself be seen with her. It was my mother who asked the question no one else would say out loud. We were sitting across from each other in her kitchen, the same table I'd eaten at 1,000 times, with the same mismatched placemats and chipped coffee mugs she refused to throw away. I'd gone to visit because she'd asked, casually, but I could tell it carried weight. "I haven't seen you in a while," she'd said. "Come by. Just you." That last part hadn't been subtle. Just you. And I knew what it meant. I didn't expect the conversation to feel like an ambush. And to her credit, it wasn't. But it didn't take long for the small talk to turn into silence, and silence to turn into questions. "She seems like a lovely woman," my mother said, her hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm tea. "Smart, kind." I waited for the but. It came, of course. "But she's 50, I nodded. "She is." She paused, watching me. "And you're 31. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't know the numbers, but because the math wasn't the point. She sighed. "Have you thought about the long term? About what that really means?" Her voice wasn't harsh. It wasn't cruel. It was maternal. Careful. Like she wanted to understand but also steer me away from something she thought I couldn't yet grasp. I stirred my coffee just to have something to do with my hands. "We talk about it," I said. "It's not something we're ignoring." She raised an eyebrow. "Does she want children?" There it was. The thing everyone danced around, always framed as concern. I felt my chest tighten. "No," I said. "She did once. But she made peace with it." My mother nodded slowly, like she was adding it to some invisible list. "And you? You sure you don't want them either?" I looked up. She wasn't accusing me. She was trying to save me from regret. From waking up one day in a life that no longer felt like mine. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I've never really been sure." That answer didn't comfort her. It shouldn't have. She leaned back and looked out the window. "It's just, I remember being your age, and thinking I knew everything. But time has a way of changing your mind, and when it does, you don't always get another chance." I wanted to get angry. I wanted to defend Eve, defend my choice. But there was no villain in this room. Just a mother worried her son was building a life on a feeling that might not survive the future. That night, I told Eve about the conversation. We were curled up on her couch, the TV on but ignored, the lights low. She didn't flinch. She didn't even seem surprised. "She's not wrong," she said softly. "I've thought about it too." I turned to face her. "About me wanting kids?" She nodded. "And about what it would mean if you woke up one day and realized I couldn't give you the things you thought you didn't need." Her voice wasn't bitter, just honest. That kind of brutal clarity she carried with her, like a gift and a curse. "Do you want me to say I'll never want them?" I asked. She shook her head. "I want you to know what you want. Not for me, for you. Because if you compromise on something that deep, eventually it'll eat you." I didn't have an answer. I didn't even have a guess. All I knew was that when I looked at her, I didn't see the absence of children. I saw a life. Full. Messy. Present. But she was right. The future didn't care about feelings. It cared about foundations. Over the next few weeks, that conversation sat with us. Not always front and center, but present. Like a quiet breath between words. I caught her watching families more closely at the market. I saw the flicker in her eyes when a baby cried at a nearby table, and I felt the knot in my stomach twist tighter each time, because I didn't know how to offer her comfort without making promises I couldn't keep. One evening, after dinner, she pulled out a shoebox from the hall closet. Inside were old photographs. Her childhood, college years, travel adventures. But deeper in the pile, I found pictures of her and Daniel, and a few of a nursery, empty, unfinished. "We were going to try," she said, barely above a whisper. And then the accident happened. She didn't cry. She didn't even blink much, just stared at the images like they were relics from a life that could have been. "I never got around to packing them away," she said. And then one day it just didn't make sense to. I sat beside her, holding one of the photos, a soft blue wall, a rocking chair, a mobile hanging from the ceiling. "You don't have to explain this to me," I said. She looked at me, her face suddenly more open than I'd ever seen it. "I'm not," she replied. "I'm showing it to you, so you know what you're stepping into. I can't give you a blank canvas. Only this one, part painted, part erased." I set the photo down, took her hand, and said the only thing that felt true. "I don't want a blank canvas. I want yours." But even as I said it, I knew that love was not a cure for time, and someday soon, we'd both have to decide whether love alone could carry us through a future full of things neither of us could give the other. It started with distance, not the kind you measure in miles, but in moments. In the pauses between sentences, the unreturned texts that used to be immediate, the soft hesitation before reaching out to touch one another, like we were afraid of what we might feel. We hadn't fought. Not once. That was part of what made it harder to see. There was no blow-up, no name-calling, no slammed doors or hurtful words. Just a slow, creeping quiet that settled over us like dust gathering in corners we hadn't noticed. We're even there. And in that quiet, we both began to think things we didn't want to say. Or maybe we'd always been thinking them. We just weren't brave enough to bring them into the light. I could feel it building the night we had dinner at her place. She made roasted vegetables and some kind of wild rice dish, the kind of meal that used to make me feel lucky just to sit across from her while she moved around the kitchen like she was composing a symphony. But that night, the silence at the table wasn't comfort. It was weight. She looked tired. More than tired. Not just from the treatment, or from work, or from the physical grind of living inside a body that didn't always cooperate anymore. She looked tired of holding on. And maybe I did too. Not to her, but to the idea that love alone was enough to outrun time. After dinner, we didn't move to the couch like we usually did. She stayed at the table, sipping wine slowly, her fingers circling the rim of the glass like she was thinking of what to say. I stayed across from her, hands folded, heart pacing. Finally, she spoke. "What if we're loving each other through an expiration date neither of us can admit?" I didn't answer right away. I wanted to say no, to reach for her hand, to pull her into me and promise her again that I wasn't going anywhere. But we'd done that already. So I just looked at her and asked, "Do you want this to end?" She shook her head slowly. "No. But I'm afraid it already is. Just not all at once." We sat in that for a long time. No rush to fix it, no rush to name it. Just the awful understanding that we were standing on opposite ends of a decision neither of us wanted to make. "You're still building your life," she said, voice steady. "And I'm learning how to live with the fact that parts of mine are being taken away piece by piece." I leaned forward. "You're not a burden." She smiled at me, sad and warm. "I know that. But you still have to carry me sometimes. And someday that weight will grow. And I love you too much to watch you resent it." I hated that she was right, because love wasn't about fairness, and she wasn't wrong for wanting to protect me from a version of the future I hadn't yet earned the scars to understand. But what she didn't know, what I hadn't figured out how to say, was that I wasn't afraid of the weight. I was afraid of being told I wasn't allowed to carry it. I was afraid that one day she'd push me away, not because I couldn't love her well, but because she'd decided I deserved a different kind of future, a cleaner one, a younger one. And that kind of love, the kind that lets go for someone else's sake, that was the one thing I wasn't ready for. She stood up and began clearing the table. I followed her instinctively, reaching for plates, wiping crumbs, pretending this was just another evening we'd forget in the long run. But it wasn't. We both knew that. After we finished, she leaned against the counter, arms crossed, looking out the window into the dark. "You'll meet someone one day," she said, "and she'll be your equal in all the ways that matter. Age, timing, goals, and she won't come with a ticking clock." I stepped closer. "You think I'm waiting for someone else?" She turned to face me. "No. I think part of you knows I'm already starting to let go, and the other part doesn't want to admit it yet." I didn't argue. I couldn't. Because that was the moment I felt it too. That tiny crack in the glass that hadn't shattered yet, but was definitely there. And I hated it. I hated that two people who loved each other as fully as we did still couldn't beat something as stupid and cold as time. I walked over, wrapped my arms around her waist, and held her as tightly as I could. "Then let me be here until you can't hold on anymore," I whispered. "Let me be here, even if it breaks us later." She buried her face in my neck, and we stood there, suspended in something too big to name. That night we slept like strangers in the same bed, close, but not touching. And in the morning, she didn't make coffee, and I didn't ask why. We just moved through the motions like people who had written the end of the story and now were quietly walking toward it, one chapter at a time. I still loved her. She still loved me. But sometimes love isn't enough to outpace the quiet logic of life. Sometimes the most painful kind of love is the one where you both see the cliff ahead, and neither of you is willing to be the one to let go of the other's hand. First, it didn't happen in one night. It never does. The unraveling was so gradual that if someone had asked me when it started, I wouldn't have had an answer. One day, I stopped sleeping over as often. The next, she stopped texting me first. The rhythm that used to feel like second. Nature, wake up, think of her, reach out, slowed into something cautious, not cold, just unsure. We still talked. We still saw each other. But the days in between grew longer. The silences stretched wider. There was no fight, no final straw, just this growing weight of knowing that something we'd built so carefully was slowly settling into its ending. We hadn't said the words, not yet, but they hung around us in the air, thick and unspoken, like smoke after a fire that no one wanted to admit had already burned the house down. I tried to fill the space. I picked up more work, started saying yes to plans I would have once turned down just to stay in and read beside her. I told myself it was healthy, that we were just giving each other breathing room. But late at night, lying in bed alone, I knew the truth. It wasn't breathing room. It was preparation. Emotional withdrawal. She was pulling back, gently and deliberately, and I was letting her. Because neither of us wanted to be the one to hurt the other. So we were trying to do it quietly, slowly. As if that would make it hurt less. The last time I saw her before the silence set in, we had lunch on her porch. The sky was overcast, the air thick with the kind of tension that can only exist between people who still love each other but don't know what to do with it anymore. She made soup. I brought bread from the bakery down the street. We talked about small things, her neighbor's new dog, the weather, a book she'd finished but didn't love. It was safe. It was easy. And that's what made it unbearable. Because underneath every word, I could feel what we weren't saying. That this was likely one of the last lunches. One of the final shared days before we gave in to the inevitable. When I stood to leave, she walked me to the door, like she always did. But this time, she didn't kiss me. She just hugged me. A little too long, a little too tight. And when she let go, she didn't meet my eyes. I opened my mouth to say something, anything. But I didn't. Because I knew if I spoke, if I said, "Please don't let go," she might stay for me. And I didn't want her to stay for me. I wanted her to stay because she still believed there was something left to hold on to. The days that followed were quiet. A couple of texts, brief and polite. I didn't call. She didn't either. And that, somehow, became the new language between us. Not saying anything. Not chasing. Letting the silence speak louder than the words we weren't brave enough to say. I started waking up feeling like something was missing. Not an object, not a task, but a person. A presence. The warmth of her breath before she stirred in the morning. The way she'd stretch her legs under the covers and always manage to steal, Half the blanket without noticing. The small, unremarkable details that you don't realize are everything until they're gone. I passed her street once a few days later. I almost turned in. Almost. But something in me said, not like this. Not in confusion. Not in desperation. So I kept driving. Knuckles white against the steering wheel, throat tight with all the things I still hadn't said. I wondered if she was thinking about me. I wondered if she cried. I wondered if she was, like me, holding her phone at night, willing it to light up with a name that used to feel like home. Eventually, a week turned into 2, then a month. We hadn't officially ended anything, but life, when left alone, will make decisions for you. And the decision it made for us was space. Real, final space. I saw her name pop up in a mutual friend's tagged photo online, at an art event, smiling politely beside someone I didn't recognize. She looked beautiful. She also looked separate. Like a chapter I'd read and reread and finally closed, even though the last page hadn't made it clear whether it was the end or just the start of something else. One night, I sat on my balcony, with a glass of wine, and finally allowed myself to cry. Not because she left, not because I left, but because we'd both held on so tightly for so long, trying to make something work that neither of us wanted to break, but couldn't keep alive without bleeding ourselves dry. Love like that. It never really dies. It just moves somewhere, quieter. Somewhere more private. A locked room inside you where sunlight still lives, even if you're not allowed back in. I haven't spoken to her since. Not really. A birthday text. A polite, warm reply. Nothing more. But every so often, I'll hear a song that played in her kitchen. Or I'll pass that bookstore where we met. And for a moment, I'll remember what it felt like to fall in love with someone who made me feel completely seen. Someone who loved me so much that she was willing to leave before she became the reason I couldn't grow. And maybe that's the most painful kind of love there is. The kind that ends not because it was broken, but because it was too good to be dragged past its natural season. The kind where no one's the villain. The kind where time, and only time, gets the last word. Time didn't offer closure. Not really. It just offered distance, the kind that made the sharp edges of memory a little less jagged, the kind that let me go hours without thinking about her, then punished me with an entire afternoon that felt like her shadow. Grief, I've learned, doesn't always come with a funeral. Sometimes it comes with silence, drawn out, polite, intentional. The kind where you both survive, but not together. Where the heartbreak isn't in what was said, but in what was never dared. I went back to the coffee shop once, the one we used to duck into after long walks or lazy errands, where the barista always wrote her name on my cup because she placed the orders. This time the cup just had mine. It felt smaller in my hands, even though it hadn't changed at all. There was a new woman at the counter who didn't know our story, didn't smile knowingly like the old one used to. It made me realize how much of a world two people can create out of habits and glances and shared playlists, how those tiny rituals feel like permanence until they're gone, and you're left explaining them only to yourself. The barista asked if I wanted oat milk or regular, and I hesitated a moment too long, like I was still waiting for someone else to answer for me. That's what missing someone really looks like, I think. Not sobbing in the dark. It's the quiet. It's forgetting how to order your own drink because you'd gotten so used to doing it with her. I didn't date for a while. Not out of some noble gesture of loyalty, but because I didn't know how to offer someone half of me when the other half was still folded up somewhere in the back of her dresser drawer, next to that old hoodie she never returned. I tried once. A co-worker who laughed at my jokes, liked old movies, seemed uncomplicated, but I caught myself comparing the sound of her laugh to Eve's. Not better. Not worse. Just different. Not her fault. Just impossible. After dinner, she texted to say she had a great time. I never replied. Because what could I say? I'm sorry, you were lovely, but you didn't ruin me in a way that made everything else feel hollow. I found myself writing again. Notes, letters, none of them sent. I didn't even know what I'd do with them. Just lines on a page that sounded like her voice in my head. I wrote about the things I never said out loud. About how some mornings, Even now, I still reach for my phone hoping to see her name. About how I walk past bookstores and wonder what she's reading. Whether she's sitting on that same patio chair with her feet curled under her, scribbling thoughts into a journal she won't let anyone see. I wondered if she missed me. Not the way I used to bring her flowers or fold her laundry while she pretended not to notice, but the way I listened. The way I held her when her body trembled at night. The way I stayed long after I was expected to leave. Sometimes I tried to justify the ending to myself. That it was the right choice. That it was cleaner this way. That loving someone and letting them go was the most selfless thing you could do. But there's nothing clean about a quiet ending. It leaves everything intact. The dishes, the text threads, the photo buried in your camera roll you can't quite delete. There's no wreckage, just residue. And the worst part? No one else sees it. You walk through the world with this invisible weight and people assume you're fine. Because there's nothing dramatic to point to. No storm. Just a beautiful day that slowly stopped being warm. I saw her once, months later, on a street I hadn't planned to walk down. She was outside a small gallery, laughing with a friend, holding a takeaway coffee in both hands like she always did. Like it was a candle she was trying to protect from the wind. She looked good. Soft sweater, hair pulled back. That same gentle way she tilted her head when listening. I stopped walking for a moment, stayed across the street, let myself just look. I didn't go over. Didn't call her name. It wasn't the moment for that. It didn't need to be. Seeing her happy, really happy, didn't break me the way I thought it would. It just confirmed what I already knew. We didn't end because we were wrong. We ended because we were right at the wrong time. And maybe that's a different kind of tragedy. Or maybe it's the only kind that matters. Later that night, I lay in bed with the lights off and no music playing, and I whispered her name into the dark. Not to summon her, not to fix anything, just to remember what it felt like to say it with meaning. There's a kind of grace in accepting that not every love story ends in forever. Some end in the middle of a sentence with a period that looks more like a pause. But those stories still count. They still shape you. And even if I never see her again, I'll always carry the version of me that existed only when I was with her. It took me almost a year to stop reaching for her. Not in the literal sense. My hands stopped moving toward my phone. My steps stopped turning down her street. But in the quiet, internal places, the ones people don't see. The space where your thoughts live when you're walking to your car, or brushing your teeth or standing in line for groceries, doing the things that make up most of life. That's where she stayed the longest, in the margins, in the silence between decisions. I'd see a book she would have loved and think, I should get that for her, before remembering I didn't have anyone to give it to anymore. Or I'd cook something new and instinctively imagine what she'd say, how she'd tilt her head after the first bite and pretend to critique it even if she liked it. That kind of memory is sticky. It doesn't fade easily. It just softens. The color drains, but the outline remains. I never hated her for letting go. I want that to be clear. I never resented her. There was no bitterness between us. Just space and the slow widening of it, like a crack in glass that grows millimeter by millimeter until one day the whole pane gives way. If anything, I admired her more for how she handled it. The grace, the clarity, the fact that she never tried to make me feel guilty for wanting things I hadn't even decided on yet. It would have been easier for her to stay and pretend, to hold on longer, to keep feeding the momentum we'd created. But she knew better. She knew love wasn't supposed to suffocate. It was supposed to expand you. And when it stopped doing that, you had to let it breathe, even if that meant letting it go. In the months that followed, I started to rebuild. Not in some cinematic way. No glow-up montage. Just quiet steps forward. I said yes to projects that used to intimidate me. I started jogging again in the mornings, not to outrun anything, but to remember what it felt like to move towards something. I redecorated my apartment, got rid of the wine glasses we always used. Not out of spite, but because they belonged to a version of life that no longer fit. And still, she was there. Not haunting, just present. In the shape of the way I folded my laundry now. In the fact that I always kept herbal tea stocked in the cupboard. In the way I started turning off my phone during dinner, like she used to. Remind me to. I met people, dated. A little at first, then more as time passed. Some were kind, some made me laugh. A few even made me wonder if I could fall again. But none of them carried the same quiet weight. None of them looked at me with that mixture of history and hope. And I stopped chasing that. I stopped comparing, because I realized she wasn't the standard. She was a lesson, a chapter, not one to repeat, but one I'd needed to read to understand what love could be when it wasn't dressed up in fantasy. Loving Eve taught me about depth, about patience, about stillness. She taught me that love isn't proven in grand gestures. It's proven in consistency, in honesty, in showing up even when it's easier to turn away. The funny thing is, I don't think I'd change anything, not even the ending. Because if it hadn't ended, I might never have learned how deeply I was capable of feeling. I might have kept coasting through relationships that looked good on paper, but left me untouched at my core. She cracked something open in me. And yes, it hurt. But it also made space, real space, the kind that doesn't just hold another person, but holds yourself, your full, unfinished self. That's what she gave me, without ever asking for credit. The permission to show up exactly as I was, while still being expected to grow. I still think about the last night I saw her, the way her arms wrapped around me like she knew, like she'd already made peace with the choice we hadn't spoken yet. I think about the quiet in her eyes, not emptiness, but understanding. Like she was already somewhere I hadn't reached, yet. It took me months to catch up to her, to understand that love doesn't always want to last forever. Sometimes it just wants to be true, and ours was. God, it was true. Every single moment of it. Even the ones that hurt, even the ones that ended in silence. Sometimes I wonder where she is now. Not geographically, but emotionally. I wonder if she's happy, if she feels free, if she ever thinks about me when the seasons change, or when the first cool breeze of autumn rolls in, the way it did the day we first kissed. I don't know if I want to see her again. I'm not sure what we'd even say, but I know that if I did, I'd smile. I'd mean it. I'd tell her thank you, not for loving me, but for letting me go when I didn't have the strength to ask her to stay. For teaching me that real love leaves fingerprints, not bruises. That it doesn't need to be eternal to be transformative. Because the truth is, some people come into your life to stay, but some come in just to wake you up. And when they leave, you're not broken. You're just different, wider, quieter, more full of questions and more willing to live without all the answers. And that's what she left me with. Not pain, not regret, but awareness. Of time. Of myself. Of the kind of man I want to be next time love finds me. I don't keep her letters. We didn't write any. But if I ever had the chance to write her one final thing, it would be this. I didn't stop loving you. I just learned how to carry it differently. You didn't disappear. You became part of the foundation. And I'll build the rest of my life. On top of that, I don't think there's a single moment when healing announces itself. No clean line, no switch that flips and suddenly makes everything okay again. It just happens slowly, so quietly that one day you wake up and realize your chest doesn't ache when you hear her name. That your memories no longer sting. You pass the bookstore, and instead of tightening your jaw, you smile. You cook the soup she once loved, and you don't feel the urge to text her a photo. You just eat it, grateful that you still remember how. That's what healing is, not forgetting, but softening. Not rewriting the story, but finally being able to close the book without needing to tear out the last chapter. That's where I was now. Not entirely free of her, but no longer owned by the absence of her. A year had passed, and life had done what life does. It moved forward, slowly at first, then all at once. Promotions, birthdays, plans with friends, conversations about things that had nothing to do with her. New faces entered my orbit. I started seeing someone. Nothing serious at first. Coffee, laughter, the occasional dinner where silence wasn't heavy, just quiet. I didn't compare. I didn't weigh the new against the old. That wasn't fair to her, or to me. I just let it be what it was. A beginning. One I didn't rush. One I didn't try to define. Because I'd learned something from loving Eve. Love shouldn't be a reaction to loneliness. It should be a decision. A choice you make when you're whole enough not to need it, but brave enough to want it anyway. One Saturday morning, I walked through the park near my place, a path I used to take with Eve during the early months when everything felt new and unreal. There was a bench there, under a crooked elm tree, where we once sat and talked about nothing for 2 hours. Just sat there, legs touching, sipping bad coffee, watching joggers and dogs and clouds. I hadn't walked that exact path since. Maybe because some part of me wasn't ready to revisit it without her. But that morning, the light was soft, the wind was warm, and I didn't feel resistance. I sat down on that same bench and let the memory play in my head. Not like a wound being reopened, but like a film I'd once loved and could finally watch again. She had changed me, there was no denying that. And not in the obvious ways, not in how I dressed or how I drank my coffee or what books I read, but in the way I listened now, in the way I gave people space to speak without filling in their silences, in the way I touched, gently, intentionally, like I knew what it meant to hold something that could leave. She made me better without trying to, just by being fully herself, unapologetically complex, unafraid to ask hard questions and even more unafraid to live without easy answers. That day on the bench, I thought about writing her. Not to rekindle anything. Not to open doors that had already been closed with care. Just to say thank you. To tell her that I'd turned out okay. That I hoped she had too. But I didn't write. Not because I didn't mean it, but because I finally understood something. Love, when real, doesn't always need to be witnessed again. Sometimes the truest expression of love is letting it rest. Letting it live in the past, where it can remain, unspoiled by time and new versions of ourselves that no longer fit the shape of what was. I don't know where she is now. Maybe she's still in the same house, watering the same plants, humming the same songs to herself when she thinks no one is listening. Maybe she's met someone who holds her hand with the same reverence I once did. Someone who walks beside her without fear of time or stories that came before. I hope so. I hope she's loved. Not because she needs it, but because she deserves it. She always did. As for me, I'm not chasing answers anymore. I'm not trying to solve love like it's some equation. I'm just living, present, grateful, open. I carry her still, but she's not a weight anymore. She's part of my architecture, the scaffolding beneath my capacity to care, to commit, to stay when things get hard. And maybe that's all love is in the end, a blueprint, a pattern carved into you by someone brave enough to stay long enough to change the shape of your heart. So if you asked me now, if you looked me in the eye and said, would you do it all again, knowing how it ends? My answer would be yes, without hesitation, without pause. I would choose her again, even knowing we'd lose each other. Because some people aren't meant to stay forever. They're meant to remind you that forever is not the goal. Presence is, growth is, becoming is, and she did that. She helped me become. So here I am, still walking, still learning, still loving. And somewhere out there, I hope she is too. Not thinking of me every day, not needing to, but knowing that somewhere in the fabric of someone else's life, her name lives like a secret, like a song that doesn't need to be played to still be remembered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.